In the silence before the collapse, there is always a moment that history forgets to record. Not because it was invisible, but because it looked too ordinary to matter. Cities were awake, markets were alive, and money moved through hands with the confidence of something eternal. Glass towers reflected sunlight like symbols of stability carved into modern civilization, but beneath that surface, something was already shifting. Decisions were being made in closed rooms, far from the streets that would eventually pay the price. Numbers grew, profits expanded, and risk was quietly repackaged into something that looked like safety. No alarms sounded, no warnings were believed, and yet the foundation had already begun to fracture, not with noise, but with precision. The collapse would not arrive as an accident, it would arrive as a consequence, carefully built over time, by those who believed the system could never break. Before everything changed, life followed a predictable rhythm. Workers left home before sunrise, offices filled with routine ambition, and economies seemed to breathe in steady cycles of growth and consumption. Credit flowed easily, investments multiplied, and trust became the invisible currency holding everything together. In homes, people measured progress through purchases, loans, and promises of a better future financed by tomorrow's earnings. Few questioned the structure supporting it all. Even fewer understood it. The system appeared too large to fail, too interconnected to stop, but in reality, its complexity was becoming its greatest vulnerability. Each layer of growth depended on another layer of borrowed stability, and at the center of it all, a small group observed the acceleration not with concern, but with calculation, recognizing opportunity where others saw permanence. The first signs of imbalance did not arrive as disaster, they appeared as success. Rising markets were celebrated, new financial instruments were praised as innovation, and expanding credit was interpreted as progress. Risk was not removed, it was redistributed, fragmented, and hidden inside systems too complex for most to examine. Analysts issued warnings, but their voices were drowned by optimism. Institutions reassured the public with confidence built more on repetition than certainty. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, exposure increased. Debt accumulated in shadows of documentation few read, and even fewer understood. It was not deception in the traditional sense. It was something more subtle. Belief in a model that required endless continuation to remain valid. And as long as growth persisted, no one asked what would happen if it stopped. As time passed, cracks began to form at the edges of the system. Defaults increased quietly, first in isolated pockets, then across broader segments of the economy. Housing markets showed strain, yet prices were defended as though they were immune to correction. Financial products built on unstable assumptions began to lose coherence, but were quickly replaced with revised explanations. The language of stability became more frequent precisely when stability was weakening. Internally, some institutions recognized the exposure. Externally, reassurance remained the dominant message. The distance between perception and reality widened with each passing cycle. And in that gap, vulnerability accumulated, waiting for a trigger that did not need to be large, only enough to reveal what had already been built. When confidence finally began to break, it did not happen in a single moment. It unfolded in sequence, like a mechanism losing alignment. One institution hesitated, another followed, and suddenly liquidity, the invisible force that kept everything moving, began to contract. Markets reacted not only to events, but to fear of events yet to come. Assets once considered secure lost their assumed stability overnight. Institutions that had appeared unshakable found themselves exposed to the very risks they had distributed across the system. And as uncertainty spread, each reaction intensified the next. It was no longer a question of isolated failure. It became a question of how much of the structure had been silently dependent on uninterrupted trust. As pressure increased, decisions were made under conditions of urgency rather than understanding. Emergency measures were introduced to contain the damage, but each intervention revealed deeper layers of dependency. The system was not failing in one place, it was revealing that failure had been embedded across many. Institutions that once projected confidence now operated in survival mode, attempting to stabilize what was already in motion. Meanwhile, the public began to feel the consequences in delayed but unavoidable forms. Frozen credit, collapsing investments, rising unemployment. The distance between financial systems and human reality disappeared. What had been abstract now became immediate, measurable in lost homes, closed businesses, and disrupted lives. The most severe transformation came when trust itself became scarce. Without trust, the system could no longer function at its intended speed. Transactions slowed, lending tightened, and economic activity contracted under its own weight. What had once been a cycle of expansion reversed into contraction, feeding itself through hesitation and withdrawal. The architecture of modern finance depended not only on capital, but on confidence in continuity. When that confidence broke, even temporary stability became difficult to sustain. Institutions intervened, governments responded, and mechanisms were activated to prevent total collapse. But the underlying structure had already changed. It was no longer the same system, only a repaired version of something that had already failed in principle. For those outside the centers of decision-making, the consequences unfolded as lived reality. Savings lost value, employment became uncertain, and futures once assumed to be stable turned fragile. Entire communities experienced the effects not as theory, but as daily pressure. In contrast, those closest to the origins of the system often remained insulated, protected by timing, position, or prior exit. This imbalance became one of the defining characteristics of the collapse, the unequal distribution of consequence. The system had expanded risk widely, but concentrated protection narrowly. And when contraction began, the weight did not return evenly. It followed paths of least resistance, reaching those least equipped to absorb it. As the immediate shock faded, the long-term consequences began to emerge. Regulations were rewritten, institutions restructured, and narratives reconstructed to explain what had occurred. Economists debated causes, assigning weight to different variables, but beneath the analysis remained a simpler reality. A system built on extended confidence had reached the limits of its own design. The collapse did not end the structure entirely, but it permanently altered its perception. What once appeared stable, now carried an awareness of fragility. Future decisions would no longer be made under the assumption of permanence, but under the memory of interruption. Over time, recovery began, but it was uneven and slow. Some sectors rebuilt quickly, adapting to new constraints and opportunities. Others never fully returned to their previous state. The landscape of wealth and security shifted, redrawing boundaries between those who had absorbed losses and those who had avoided them. New systems emerged, designed with greater caution, yet still dependent on the same fundamental principles of trust and circulation. The memory of collapse lingered not as a single event, but as a structural lesson embedded in policy and behavior. Yet even lessons fade when time restores comfort, and with comfort, the cycle of expansion slowly resumes. In reflection, the collapse reveals a pattern repeated across history in different forms. Systems expand, confidence grows, complexity increases, and risk becomes distributed in ways that are no longer visible until conditions change. The appearance of stability masks underlying fragility. And by the time correction begins, the structure is already fully exposed. What remains is not only economic consequence, but a deeper understanding of how interconnected belief and behavior sustain entire systems. And when that belief is interrupted, the scale of impact extends far beyond those who initiated it. The story does not conclude with resolution, but with recognition. Recognition that collapse is rarely sudden and almost never accidental. It is a process shaped over time, built through decisions that individually appear rational, but collectively create imbalance. And when that imbalance reaches its limit, the outcome is no longer a matter of choice, but of inevitability. What remains after is a transformed system, carrying within it the memory of what happened when trust outpaced understanding, and when the confidence of few became the vulnerability of many. In the end, the silence returns. Markets stabilize, cities rebuild their rhythm, and life resumes its outward appearance of continuity. But beneath that surface, something irreversible has changed. The system continues, but it remembers.